It's my delight today to be able to introduce our special guest speaker, but as I'm beginning to do that, I'm just grateful to see Garth Steele, last year's speaker, with us again today. So wonderful to have you back with us. And so today our special guest speaker is from Montreal. Daria Nardozza is someone who grew up there in the West Island area of the city. She, as you see in your program, has led the West Island Network, which is very similar to Love Ottawa, bringing together churches in that part of the city to work together for greater impact. And that also is under the umbrella of Christian Direction, a similar ministry to One Way Ministries here. Daria is also on staff with Waybase the last few years as the director of community engagement, something that I think really fits what her experience is. She has been very active in her community. In fact, they made her the co-facilitator of the Poverty Reduction and Social Inclusion Roundtable in the West Island recently. And I'm looking forward to hearing stories about what they've learned that we as a city in Ottawa could gain. Some of us get to see Daria online on a monthly basis because she also chairs a national Zoom call for Canadian city reachers. And we love the fact that there are more than 15 cities, I think, represented most times on that call from across Canada, all thinking about how we can be a blessing to our cities. Before her husband Matt came along, and then her son Gabriel, my wife and I got to meet Daria out on the west coast, British Columbia, back in 2009. And she was leading 24/7 Prayer Canada at the time, and we heard amazing stories about what God was doing in the streets of Montreal through their team. So this morning, I'm really looking forward to more stories from Daria, things that will inspire us. Daria, welcome to Ottawa. Welcome to our Civic Prayer Breakfast.
Well, it's great to be here. I don't think I've ever spoken to this many people this early in the morning. Bonjour à tous, je suis vraiment heureuse de voir un grand nombre et je remercie d'être présent ce matin à cet événement. Thank you so much to One Way and Love Ottawa. What you guys do here in Ottawa is such a blessing to the rest of Canada, and you are teaching us and leading us as cities across Canada through the work that you do and through events like this to honor the people here. So who was here last year? Anyone? I think a lot of people were here last year. I got to be here online, and it was such a gift for me to hear from Garth. And what he had to say. He introduced us to this Art of Neighboring book, and I actually immediately ordered it because I was so intrigued by what he shared. But there's this idea of, and you'll see it up on the screen, but this tool that was created to know your neighbors and to know your neighborhood. And this idea is that you live in the middle, and to write the names and something about each of your neighbors. And this tool actually came about through a group in Arvada, Colorado. There was a group of 24 pastors who actually called the mayor in, and they wanted to hear from the mayor. They asked him, "What is your dream for the city? And if you could wave a magic wand and change anything about your city, what would it be?" And so the mayor takes out his list, and he starts just mentioning some of the things on his heart. And he said, "I want to live in a community where there is no isolated senior shut-ins, where there's no single parents living below the poverty line, where there's no financial debt." And he went on to keep mentioning these things, and these 24 pastors are writing notes like, what can we do to address this? And then the mayor suddenly, in passing, just finally suggests, and he says, "The smartest thing pastors could do for the city is to start a neighboring movement." And he said, Think of the thousands of people in your congregations and the impact that they could have on their neighborhoods if they would just know and love their neighbors. And he said, relationships always trump programs. And he said, as a mayor, we get requests to start different programs for different needs in the community, but the reality is that with programs, the finances eventually run out and the programs sometimes end. But with relationships, they're so foundational to any good program anyway. And we must start with relationship. And he said, wouldn't it be better to be cared for through a relationship than through a program? And as these pastors start to develop this idea and work through this, and they started to work with government leaders, what the government leaders actually said was that people who have close bonds with their neighbors live longer. Where people know the names of their neighbors, crime is actually 60% less, which is why we should write the names of our neighbors and know them. And when natural disasters strike, your neighbors are your first responders. And I'm sure you saw that this May, even through COVID. This is really significant. This is something that I've been thinking through a lot in my neighborhood. My husband and I moved to our neighborhood 12 years ago when we got married. And something that we do every year is we bake cookies and bring Christmas cards to our neighbors. And I have this one neighbor, we'll call her Monique. And those neighbors that are sometimes a little bit harder to love? When we first moved in, we were brand new homeowners, and she would tell us everything that we're doing wrong in running our house. She's an elderly lady, and she has arthritis all over her body, but she still manages to have the most beautiful lawn, and in the winter, she has like 0 snow on her driveway. It's incredible. And her backyard fence actually extends to like the city line of almost the road. And then she has a tape across her driveway so that nobody could turn around in her driveway, leaving tire marks on her driveway. Now, this is not how I operate. She is very, very different than I am. And to be honest, I often feel like I'm doing a bad job as loving her as a neighbor. I remember going to her house about 4 years ago and being in her kitchen and seeing her fridge. And across her fridge, she had 6 years of my Christmas card on it, my family Christmas card, a picture of my family on her fridge. And I said, wow, you still have all these? So I was going down memory lane looking at her fridge, just so amazed that all these pictures were there. And she said, of course I do. I love looking at these pictures every day. You guys are like my family. It really doesn't take much to know and to love your neighbors and to be kind. And I think we often underestimate the impact of just being kind and neighborly to those around us. So I can't recommend enough creating a chart, if you haven't, or finding a way to use a tool to know your neighbors, to know their names, to know something about them, to say hi to them. And if you want me to email you this, you could Google it and the art of neighboring and get this tool. They've actually printed 80,000 magnets of this for people to help start this neighboring movement and to love their neighbors. So I'm happy to email that to you if you'd like. So as Richard mentioned, I formerly led the West Island Network, which is a network of churches working together for the good of the West End of Montreal. And I'll put a map up. This is what the West End is. Montreal is an island, for those who don't know. So it's about a third of the island, the western tip. And there's about 250,000 people that live in the West End of Montreal, about 99 churches. This map is from Waybase. You could look up this map on waybase.com of your own community and learn your own demographics and learn about your community through waybase.com as well. But in the fall of 2019, our West Island Network CATE team, Community Action and Impact team, which was made up of about 10 people from 9 different churches, came together to start researching hidden poverty in the West Island, to come up with a project that we as churches could do together to reduce hidden poverty. And so the West Island is known to be a more affluent and more English part of Montreal. However, there's still many pockets of poverty and a lot of hidden poverty and broken relationships. I love the way one of my mentors puts it, Glenn Smith, when he says, unfortunately, poverty is often viewed and portrayed in economic terms. Essentially, poverty is about relationships, not just about economics. Poverty is a broad concept including economic, social, emotional, physical, and spiritual realities. It is often intergenerational. It affects people's identity, social exclusion, absence of harmony in life and well-being, and their vocation, deprivation at every level of life, including the ability to participate in the welfare of their community. That is poverty. And so we interviewed people in the community to learn about the different assets and the different needs. And at the time, I'd actually just started facilitating our poverty reduction and social inclusion roundtable, working with many community organizations in the West Island. And so our CATE team met with our poverty reduction roundtable and started to really understand what was making up the West Island and what are our needs. And at the end of it, we actually came up with the exact same conclusion as the mayor of Arvada, Colorado. I didn't know it at the time. But what if we could help mobilize the churches in the West Island and the people in the community to know and love their neighbors and their neighborhoods? What if we could start a love your neighbor movement? Isn't that what Jesus told us to do anyway? By Christmas, we had decided that this would be our mission and that we would launch in March with a campaign to love your neighbors. And literally a week before our big meeting to bring together different stakeholders, leaders, civic leaders, community organizations, and churches, a week before that meeting, COVID hit. And so we did our first pivot, and we did this meeting on Zoom. And we had about 25 leaders come together, and that was the launch of our top 10 ways to love your neighbors during COVID-19. And so we created this resource. Churches shared it, community organizations shared it. We printed thousands of them, gave them out door to door, and encouraged people to love their neighbors during COVID-19. We also printed this card that people could print themselves and leave with their neighbors, just letting their neighbors know that if they have a need, whether it be groceries or medication pickup or a visit, a friendly porch visit, that they were there and they were their neighbors and they could help support them through this difficult early season of COVID. And then when the big give happened, in June, our churches partnered with our local food banks, and we did a huge food drive. We partnered with Meals on Wheels and made gift bags for isolated seniors. And for the first time, I saw churches, community organizations, and civic leaders work together for good in their community. And as our poverty reduction and social inclusion roundtable started to identify more and more needs, something that kept coming up was social isolation. And one of our gaps in services was actually that people didn't know the services out there. So we started doing porch visits and going door to door, especially in the communities that were identified as highly senior populations and people living alone. And we just tried to break social isolation that way. A collective impact effort of the community. And so as I think through these past few years, I think something that I've realized is so important is the important role of empathy in our world. We've had the opportunity to either flex our empathy muscles or become incredibly apathetic to the world around us. This summer, I got to attend the Global Leadership Summit, which is always an amazing 2-day leadership experience for me. And my favorite talk was by someone by the name of Johnny C. Taylor Jr., and he talked about the critical role of empathy in leadership. He spoke about apathy versus empathy, and he shared the story of a 58-year-old woman named Sheila from London. She died in her London apartment building in August of 2019. And that's not the tragic part. Death is tragic. 58 is young. But the tragic part was that she was only found this past February. She lay dead for 2.5 years before somebody found her. Not one person went to check on her. Not the landlord, not the housing association. A neighbor even reported maggots and flies coming from her apartment. I'll spare you the rest of those details because you guys are eating breakfast. But you read the articles about it, and it's really sad and disturbing to hear about. The landlord said, and he described in a news report, that she was simply forgotten. They failed to join the dots. This, Taylor argued, is humanity at its worst. There are so many Sheilas in this world who live life completely unseen. And I'm sure everyone here could think of a Sheila in their life. He then goes on to say, we have a deep cultural problem. One I would argue is the biggest thing facing us globally. We have an empathy deficit. For a lot of reasons we could point to: sharp political division, the isolation made easy by technology, the deterioration of civility. We have given up on understanding the hearts of our fellow human beings. We've collectively lost the ability to look through others' eyes, to walk in their shoes. I often ask myself, and today I ask you, how did we arrive at this empathy gap? Then he goes on to say that we've set up these permanent rivalries. We are as diverse as we've ever been, yet we're also as divided as we've ever been. Me versus you, left versus right, men versus women, urban versus rural, black versus white versus yellow versus brown, white collar versus blue collar, millennial versus baby boomer versus Gen Z. If you're not with me, then you're against me. I'm right, so you are wrong. You're not like me, so I don't like you. Someone like you hurt me, so I'm gonna hurt you back. Our world is currently a hard place to live, which is why we need to flex our empathy muscles, possibly like never before. Engage in discussion, not in debate. Be an extreme listener, quick to listen and slow to speak. Again, this is what Jesus taught us. Engage in discussion, not debate. Embrace diversity. We human beings have a lot more in common, and we need to learn to be kinder. Lacking empathy is extremely easy these days, especially on the internet, where witnesses use their phones not to help you, but to record your tragedy so they could post it on social media. Empathy is a muscle that we must strengthen. Better caring for our neighbors, being more present to those around us is a must if we're going to see positive transformation happen both in our cities and globally. So a day later, after hearing this story of Sheila, I was deeply moved by it and convicted. And I was outside, saw my neighbor, Monique, and I started to tell her about this. And as I told you, she has arthritis all over her body. In her most recent text message to me last week, she actually told me that she's fallen 51 times since her surgery in June. And she lives in a split-level house with many stairs. And I keep thinking to myself, what if she fell? Would she be Sheila? At the same time, I was actually researching Apple Watches because my Apple Watch had just died. And I learned that the new Apple Watch detects falls if you fall. And I know that she wears an Apple Watch. And so I was outside the next day with my son, and I start telling her the story of Sheila with so much conviction. And I start telling her about her Apple Watch and how It would detect her fall if she falls, and she could set me up as an emergency contact, and I work from home, and I'm often home, and I could come and I could help you. And I'm trying to convince her to set this up on her Apple Watch. And she interrupts me, and she says, Daria, I can't even believe you're telling me this story right now. My son just told me the exact same story. He lives in an apartment half an hour away from us in the West Island where I was working. And he had been smelling the smell, he had been seeing maggots and flies, and he didn't know what it was. And finally, weeks later, not 2.5 years later, but weeks later, they realize we haven't seen so-and-so, the guy upstairs that normally comes down for a cigarette at least once a day. We have not seen him in weeks. And finally, someone went up to his apartment building to see if he was there, and he was actually just about to open the door, and he had fallen, and he had died. And nobody found him for weeks. These stories don't just happen in the mega cities of London. They happen in our very own communities and our very own neighborhood. So I repeat, we must strengthen our empathy muscles. To conclude, I'd like to share a more personal story about empathy, love, and hidden poverty. The neighborhood that I grew up in has no appearance of economic poverty. You'll see a slide up here. The average family income, I actually just discovered through looking on Waybase, is close to $600,000 a year. Just to be clear, this is not my current neighborhood. This is the one I grew up in. And so this was my home, 3,200 square feet, a big in-ground pool in the backyard. From the outside, this looks like a great place to live. But from the inside, it was actually a really hard place to live. I remember getting a ride home from swimming when I was in grade 7, my first year of high school. I'd met a girl, and I was going to walk home, and she said, hey, my dad could give you a ride home. And so her dad's driving me home, and I'm navigating him through my neighborhood, telling him where my house is. And then we pull into my driveway. And he turns around and he looks at me and he says, Daria, is this where you live? I say, yeah, this is where I live. I just pointed you here. And he says, Daria, are you okay? And maybe for the first time, I wondered if I was okay. Was I not supposed to be okay? He said, Daria, I am a police officer, and I've been to your house many times. I have arrested your dad, and I've put him in jail. I know you, I know your story, I've seen your situation, and are you okay? My dad struggled with an alcohol addiction. His father was an immigrant from Ukraine and also struggled with the same addiction. And actually, as far as we could see back, at least 5 generations of men in my dad's family struggled with anxiety and depression, which led to an alcohol addiction. My dad was an intelligent and really funny guy, but when he would drink, he would become extremely abusive, to the point of watching him almost kill my mother multiple times. So I lived in a lot of hidden poverty and brokenness as a child. And through my dad's addiction and my parents' broken relationship, my siblings and I struggled with everything from food insecurity to the fear of just being at home. My life could have ended up really different if it wasn't for a few people in my life. Something else that Garth mentioned last year was that your neighbor is not just your neighbor, but it's the people that God put in your life. It could be the person at the gym next to you. It could be the person in the cubicle next to you. But there's 3 people who have really impacted my life and changed the trajectory. First was my grade 6 teacher, Claudia Anzavino. And she saw my pain as a 12-year-old girl that I didn't even understand yet. And she would listen to me after school, and she would talk with me. When I was in grade 7 and 8, she hired me to be a mother's helper to her, and I would come to her house twice a week just to bring her older son to the pool. And she would always ask me, "Daria, are you okay?" And then there was a man named Peter Gibson, a ministry director at a camp that I worked at when I was 16. I did all the textbook things that fatherless teenage girls do, and I knew I needed to get away from my home that summer. And so I went to work at a camp in the Muskokas near my grandparents' house. And even that summer, I made a lot of very bad choices, and I should have been fired at least twice that summer. But Peter knew my story, he saw my pain, and he didn't give up on me. On my last day at camp, he called me into his office, and he gave me my first Bible, and he prayed for me. And it was on that 6-hour drive home that day, in September of 1999, that I finally said, "God, I surrender, and I'm going to follow you." And then there was my grandmother, still alive today, 92 years old, living with my mom and stepdad in Cornwall. And she never stopped praying for me. She never stopped loving me. She saw me through the ups and downs and every season of my life. So I don't know who you are today, what role you find yourself in: a police officer, a civic leader, a teacher, a ministry leader, a grandparent, a neighbor. But your impact on the lives of those around you, it matters. The love and the empathy that you show to every person you come in contact with, it makes a difference. I want to finish by reading this passage from Romans 12. We started with the end of it, and I'm going to finish by reading the beginning of it. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing that you could do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to the culture, to the lack of empathy and the disunity, that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best in you, of you, develops you into well-formed maturity. May God bless you guys as you neighbor your city of Ottawa. Thank you.